So we are learning how to pray yet from the book of Habakkuk. And he had to learn that as well. How can Habakkuk and how can we stay faithful to God by learning how to pray yet in trying times? The book opens up by saying the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. Habakkuk saw an oracle. That's kind of an interesting phrase because the word oracle means inspired speech. That is to say, a prophecy directly from God. But notice that he said he saw it, which means that this book of Habakkuk is partly visual. It's visionary. We've got inspiration of a message, but we've got him seeing it in, some kind of vision. And when we get to chapter 3, we'll especially see that in a powerful way. So Habakkuk sees an oracle, and he offers right out of the gate a first complaint. That's in verses 2-4, and I want to read it from the ESV. This is what he says. "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save?" You can already sense the emotion and the frustration in this prophet learning to pray yet. Verse 3, "Why do you make me see iniquity?" The prophet saying, "Lord, why all of this moral degradation and impurity? Why do I have to look on that? I'm trying to be your prophet. I'm trying to be holy and righteous. And why do you look idly on at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is," we almost need a drum roll for this. "The law is paralyzed." Now, for a Jewish person to say that was an incredible statement, very strong in emotion, because one of the ways you knew you were part of God's people was the law. I mean, God had given this as special instruction to his people, and this identified them. They derived their identity from having the law. And he says the law is just paralyzed. Justice never goes forth. There's no law enforcement. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. In this first complaint of this minor prophet, he starts by saying, "How long?" That's often the cry of believers who feel that the world is just dissing them. And let's be honest, it's an honest cry. It's the same thing the persecuted saints cried in the book of Revelation in chapter 5, verse 10. But here's the thing, though, very different. For Habakkuk, it's not the world that's dissing the righteous. It's the righteous. It's the people of God themselves. Habakkuk sees the evil within his own people. Habakkuk sees within his own people idolatry and immorality and impurity and violence and the lack of justice. Habakkuk is thinking to himself, God is not paying attention to things. Maybe it'd be good for us to ask, does it seem to you that God is sometimes asleep on your deal? Remember the first story of the calming of the storm with Jesus and the disciples in Mark 4:35-41? Jesus has been preaching all day and he is exhausted. And he falls asleep on the cushion in the fishing boat as the disciples and he are on the Sea of Galilee. A storm comes up and he's so bone tired, he can't wake up. They had to shake him awake when they were in the storm. And the seeming inactivity of God was a problem for the disciples. Lord, do you not care that we perish? Actually, Habakkuk is having the same problem. The seeming inactivity of God is a huge mountain of doubt for Habakkuk to climb. Habakkuk knows that God's people are being violent. A word, by the way, that's used quite a bit from Genesis to Kings. So not so much in the prophetic literature, not so much in the poetic literature of the Old Testament, but from Genesis to Kings, there's a lot of violence. It reminds one of Genesis 6 with the flood narrative of Noah, that God was grieved in his heart that he had made man because his thoughts and intentions were evil continually. So Habakkuk wonders why, as a prophet, he has to look at how bad things are. It's as if God forced him. God took him by the nape of the neck and said, "Here, Habakkuk, look. He's looking at iniquity, moral impurity, destruction and violence are everywhere, and God seems, from Habakkuk's perspective, to sit just idly by. Strife and contention are just running rampant. And Habakkuk notices that even God's law, as I mentioned, so special to the people of God, just seems paralyzed. No formal law enforcement, justice is lacking, and the wicked seem to be winning. It makes one think of Psalm 73, where the psalmist looked at his wicked neighbor and he said, "My feet almost slipped. When I saw how good my neighbor was doing, I was trying to do God's will and it got me nowhere. And yet my neighbor seems to be just doing quite fine and he doesn't care about the things of God." But a little later in the Psalm 73, he says, "But then I entered the sanctuary of God," and he got God's perspective, heaven's perspective on what was going on earth. And he began to change his tune. He realized his feet weren't the ones slipping. It was the wicked's feet who were slipping. And that's what Habakkuk will have to learn as well. So we move from the first complaint, that's Habakkuk's, to the first response, and that's God's. And we read about that in verse 5 and down through about verse 11. And earlier in the introductory lesson, we called this the section where God said, "Nuh-uh, nuh-uh." If the first section is, "Hello, God, are you paying attention?" God said, "I am paying attention. I'll show you." Verse 5, "Look among the nations," God says to the prophet, "and see, wonder, and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe even if you were told." Now, I want you to remember that little line, because that little line, Habakkuk 1:5, is quoted in the New Testament at a very significant place in the book of Acts. We'll come back to it. God goes on to address his prophet in verse 6. "For behold, here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do. Buckle up for this. I am raising up the Chaldeans." The Chaldeans? You mean like the people that have now come to power that we know as the Babylonians? After the Assyrians, Babylon arose. The Chaldeans, oh my. They're a bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. How about this? Habakkuk starts talking about their war machinery. Their horses are swifter than leopards. That's quite an expression. More fierce than the evening wolves. The wolves coming out of the evening because they're hungry and they need to attack to get something to eat. Their horsemen press proudly on. They sit erect in their saddles. Their horsemen come from afar, and they fly like an eagle, swift to devour its prey. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress. Anything built against them, they laugh. For they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. Now, there's a lot in that first response by God to this troubled prophet. But we get to overhear in this section what God is saying to Habakkuk's complaint. And frankly, this is a little intimate, just to be real honest. We get to go inside Habakkuk's prayer closet in this particular section. I mean, how would else we know the way of God, the will of God, the message of God? We get to hear what God said to Habakkuk in the midst of his own prayer closet. This is pretty intimate. And God actually says, nuh-uh. God says, I know what's going on, and I'm going to do something about it. In fact, the phrase, "I am doing a work," is literally what we call a Hebrewism. And a Hebrewism just means you're piling up the words. You're heaping up the words. Like when God says to Eve, "In multiplying, I will multiply thy pain in bearing children." Much the same thing here. Literally what it says in the Hebrew Bible is, a worker is working. Well, that doesn't make too much sense until you realize, okay, this is God speaking, so he's talking about himself. I am doing a work, but you won't believe it. Now, that statement is quoted in a very interesting place. On the first missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas, they go out from Antioch of Syria, and they plant 6 new churches in 2 years after traveling 1,200 miles. They give their typical synagogue address in chapter 13, and it's to the Antioch of Pisidia. So there's 2 places, Antioch of Syria that sent them out, Antioch of Pisidia, where we have kind of a typical synagogue sermon. It's a bird's eye view of the Bible. It's what Paul would have said in just about any synagogue he would have entered. And at the end of it, instead of sounding the wooing note, instead of kindly encouraging people to respond warmly to the love of God, he says, I am accomplishing a work in your day, a work you will never believe, you scoffers. It's from Habakkuk 1:5. This is quoted for Paul to try to tell the people he's preaching the gospel to, you'd better respond or judgment will be coming. Kind of an interesting use of this text. Well, verse 6 says, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians to punish all the wickedness in my own people. The nation of Babylon is going to march against Judah, and I want you to look at how that nation of Babylon is described. As God gives his first response to Habakkuk's first complaint, you can make quite a little list of the character, of the ways of Babylon. Verse 6, these warriors that will come from Babylon are bitter and hasty. They have a mean streak in them, and they are going to be fast. Verse 6, they are good marchers. They can march off a number of miles per day. They're going to cross that desert or go up around the Mesopotamia, Fertile Crescent, the Mesopotamia highway, and come down and crush Israel and Judah. Verse 6, they steal. They are not unaccustomed to, as they conquer peoples in their path, to make their way to Judah, and I might historically add, on the way to Egypt. They steal in the process. Most armies have done that through the years. They would conquer somebody and then steal their goods, plunder their goods. Verse 7, they are dreaded and fearsome, and they're described in great figures of speech, which would indicate those things. Verse 7, they have their own definitions of justice and dignity. They can play the game of saying, well, here's how we think justice works. Here's what we think is dignified, but it may be very, shall I use this word, pagan in the ways of God. Their war ability is described as horses, and in 2 ways, like leopards, that would be fast, and like wolves, that would be tenacious. And wolves, by the way, in the Bible is often used as a reference for false teachers. And the riders in those horses, as fast as eagles, verse 8. They are fierce and intent, verse 9. They gather their enemies like sand. Well, you can pick up a bunch of sand in just a bucket in an instant, verse 9. Foreign kings and rulers are nothing to these Babylonians. They just scoff at them and laugh at them, verse 10. They're as fast as the wind, verse 11. They are arrogant and they worship, here's a phrase for you, their own might, verse 11. They worship themselves, which at the end of the day is kind of what we all do, really. Tony Campolo tells about sociologists who studied the Aborigines in New Zealand and noticed that each of them had, various traits that the tribes would worship. Tribes that thought that the great virtue was to be able to run fast would worship the deer, fast as a deer. Those that wanted to worship the idea of strength, you're as strong as an ox, so they worship the ox. Those tribes that I guess weren't too fast and too strong wanted to be smart, so worship wise as an owl, and they worshiped the owls. But this sociologist realized that in worshiping what they thought was a great trait, characteristic, they were in reality worshiping themselves, turning to self as the key deity. Well, you can see as God gives this, what's this going to do to the prophet? I mean, Habakkuk is really going to struggle now. First, Habakkuk had a problem with the seeming inactivity of God. Now, he has a problem with the seeming activity of God. And that's the struggle of faith and doubt that we all face. How do we pray yet when God's ways seem so foreign to our way of thinking? Elie Wiesel said it this way: no faith is as good as a wounded faith. No faith is as good as a wounded faith. Sometimes our faith has to take some wounds for it to really be strong. Here's a very disturbing New Testament passage that I think lines up quite nicely with Habakkuk's first complaint and God's first response. It's 1 Peter 4:17, and it says this: judgment begins, oh, I don't like this next part, with the household of God. If it begins with us, imagine what it will be for those who don't obey God. But it begins with us. We have to learn how to pray yet, even when God's ways seem most strange.